Proper etiquette is a way that we show respect to others. It can get complicated at times because different places have different expectations when it comes to etiquette. I'm a bit on edge every time I attend a military change of command or retirement ceremony because military ceremonies have their own expectations and etiquette. And they also have people that are heavily armed, so I don't really want to mess up there. Church also has its own etiquette. And frankly, I'm a bit concerned. We've been doing church at home on the couch in our PJs for so long. Now some are starting to trickle back to the building, and etiquette may be an issue. Some may forget the proper way to act when they're at church with others at the building. So I've invited a guest speaker to remind us of some things that have to do with proper church etiquette.
I've been going to church all my life. I know something about it now. And it's just some things I wish they stopped doing up at the church that's concerning me about the church. Some stuff I wish they stopped doing. And here they go. Just because it's the testimonial portion of service don't necessarily mean you got to talk. Try to wait on something meaningful or miraculous to happen in your life before you jump up to testify. I used to go to church and people just testify about the stupidest little mess. You know, God big, God do miracles. Nobody want to hear this little bitty thing that happened to you today. You know, I was at Payless Shoes the other day, and I bought a pair of shoes, and I got them shoes home, and you know, Lord, I just ain't want them shoes no more. So I took them shoes back down to the Payless, and Lord Jesus, I had my receipt. And Lord, they give me all my money back. Glory, hallelujah. That ain't a testimony. That's a store policy. Here's another thing I wish they stopped doing at the church. If you got a weak bladder, stop sitting in the middle of the road. You know you got to go all the time. Sit in the overfield room. Sit over there by the bathroom door. Stop sitting in the middle of the road. Now you got to get up 8, 9 times. You know you wide, cutting through the aisle, knocking everybody's hat off. You wiping women's lipstick off. Here's another one I wish y'all would stop doing. If you go to church just once a month, there are those of us who go just once a month, try to go on communion, you know, figure that'll get us in. Here's what I hate. When the tray come around and it's communion, stop letting your fingers touch all the crackers. You moving them out the way, shuffling, trying to find a big one. This ain't no meal. This is a holy ritual. Now you done got a handful of them. You gonna go to hell.
Okay, that was fun. But there's a grain of truth in what Steve Harvey says here. Church etiquette is no joke. We don't want to be a distraction to people who are trying to worship God. And breaches in church etiquette can become serious distractions. When I was a youth minister in Memphis, the preacher once gave a sermon on etiquette as asked by the elders. He made several of the same points that Steve Harvey made, although not nearly as funny, but one point was totally different. His last point in the sermon was, don't clip your toenails in church. Well, there's a story behind that. We had a guy that sat in the back off in one of the wings, and he would clip his toenails every Sunday. He took off his shoes and his socks, propped the foot a foot up on the pew and clipped his toenails. For some reason, people around him found that to be distracting. Now, what if someone found a manuscript of that toenail clipping sermon in 500 years? What might they think about the toenail clipping factions in our churches? Might they think that we have no greater problems in churches to talk about than the clipping of toenails? Might they be confused because maybe by that time they have robots to clip their toenails? Well, we come to 1 Corinthians 14 in our series, Seen and Heard Women in the Church Today. The sermon Paul is preaching in 1 Corinthians 14 is about worship etiquette. The church was operating in a way where people were being distracted in their worship. And that was causing more disunity in the church there, like they needed any more disunity. Well, our problem as we read this chapter is the same as those finding the toenail sermon in 500 years. We know that Paul is dealing with distractions in worship. We know that he's dealing with tongue speakers and prophets. We also know that it had something to do with women. But all that we know from the situation is that which we can tweeze out of the text itself. The text tells women to be silent, but it also tells some other people to be silent as well. Like the toenail sermon, there's a story behind that. Let's see if we can uncover it. The problem was that the worship at Corinth was chaos. We'll see how a little bit later. But Paul begins by saying that the assembly must build up worshipers and not tear them down. So 1 Corinthians 14 verse 26. What shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. Everything must be done so the church may be built up. Now, we immediately notice when we read that verse that their church seems to be much more informal and much more participatory. People had things that they were expecting to do. They came to church with a hymn, a word of instruction, which, by the way, seems to be a code for a sermon, and much more. Well, they met in house churches that had limited sizes of 20 to 30 because of the size of the houses. When you're in a small and informal home setting, that lends itself to more participation and less worry about forms and format. That's why we've always tried to get more people into small groups so that they can participate. That's why we've tried to get all kinds of people to participate in these video services. When you participate, you feel more a part. Now, Paul is 100% for this informal participation in songs and teaching, even in tongues. What he is 100% against is confusion, chaos, disorder, and disarray. He is going to say that God is not a God of chaos or disorder. In verse 33, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the churches of the Lord's people. So Paul says that everything must be done so that the church may be built up. Worship must be ordered and conducted so that it is uplifting, so that it builds people up. This is at the heart of everything that's going to follow in this text. In fact, the word for build up here is literally the word for building a house. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. Romans 14. The word mutual edification is that word for building up a house. In Romans 15 and verse 2, each of you should please our neighbors for their good to, same word, build them up. Well, that's what Paul is saying for church on Sunday, but that's not only for Sunday. Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for, same word, building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Well, Corinth was disruptive and distracting in their worship. That was tearing people down. Everything done in church must be for the purpose of building people up. Now, he's going to deal with 3 different disruptions, but there's a story behind that. We need to take a note of the context to fully appreciate that full story. There's an overall context and there's an immediate context. We need to keep both in mind. To be honest, our specific study this morning in the role of women only has to do with 2 verses in these 3 chapters. But to understand what Paul is saying in those 2 verses, we need to understand these 3 chapters. So sit back, get comfortable, order a pizza. This could take a while. But don't doze off, because that wouldn't be proper etiquette. In chapter 12, Paul says that God gives a diversity of gifts to bless and build up the body. Some thought they had the more important gift, and that made them more important to the church. The only problem was they couldn't agree on which gift was the most important. The tongue speakers thought their gift was the most important. The prophets thought their gift was the most important. Paul says that we need all of the gifts and that no one is important or unimportant because of their gifts. Just like our body are made up of many parts that do many different things, Christ's body has many members and many gifts, and they're all important to the overall body. No member is more important because their gift is more important. Years ago, one of the elders said, "You know what we need to do? We need to trade in some of our rocket scientists for a plumber." At that time, we had 7 rocket scientists working at NASA, but we also had leaky pipes, and we didn't have a single plumber in the church. Sometimes the gifts that are the most important are the ones that you need at the moment, and the church needs them all. In chapter 13, in talking about gifts, Paul says there's a more excellent way than fighting over gifts, and that is the way of love. If you have the gift of prophecy and can reveal all knowledge, but you don't have love, it's nothing. If you have the gift of tongues and can talk even in the tongues of angels, but you don't have love, you're just making noise. Love is the most important of the gifts, and it is the only spiritual gift that we're all to have. If you don't have love, then nothing else that we do matters a bit. Chances are, if you're feuding and fighting over anything, particularly about who has the best gifts at church, what you need really is more love. Well, when we get to chapter 14, Paul gets down to brass tacks. He gets specific on some of the issues that they were specifically having problems with. He's going to deal with 3 different issues of etiquette. Notice how he begins chapter 14. He says, "Follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in tongues does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort." See, the specific problem was between the tongue speakers and the prophets. Everybody thought they should get the most speaking time because, after all, their gift was the most important. Like in some situations, you think what you have to say is more important than what somebody else has to say, and that can cause problem. Have you ever been in a situation where people just talked over and past one another? Things got loud and people were talking at the same time and no one could understand what was being said. Can you remember being in a situation like that? If not, then just remember the last presidential debate. Well, that was church at Corinth. Talk, talk, talk. No one listening. Everybody trying to outshout the other one because they thought that what they had to say was more important. And Paul says to everyone, why don't you just be quiet? Now, he does pick a side in the prophets versus tongue-speaking debate. He says that prophecy is the best gift because it is done to build others up. He spends much of chapter 14 downplaying the importance of tongues and upgrading the gift of prophecy. But his main point is whether you're speaking in tongues or whether you're prophesying, only one person speaks at a time. Well, that brings us back to 1 Corinthians 14:26 and dealing with distractions. Everything must be done, he says, so the church can be built up. Now, before we look at the specific problems, the 3 groups that he talks to, let's read the whole text in one lump. Odette, Ayana, and Andre are going to do that for us. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 26 through 35.
What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up.
Everything must be done so that the church may be built up.
Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. And if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at the most 3 should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God.
2 or 3 prophets should speak, and others should weigh carefully what is said. If a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. Spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people.
For God is not a God or order but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people.
For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says.
If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home.
For it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church.
Paul says similar things to these 3 different groups. In fact, as we'll see, he uses the exact same word when talking to these groups. He speaks to the prophets, he speaks to the tongue speakers, and he also speaks to some of the women at Corinth as well. 3 groups, but they were causing the exact same problem. They were disrupting the worship of the church. First, the tongue speakers are told to be quiet if there was no interpreter present. Verse 27, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or 3 at most should speak one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and God. So only 2 or 3 tongue speakers are to speak in any one service, and then only one at a time. They're supposed to take turns. And they can only speak if there's someone there to interpret, to translate what is said so that everyone can understand. Remember, Paul's basic concern is that the body be built up. And no one is going to be built up if they can't understand what is going on. So what if someone wants to speak in tongues and there is no interpreter? The tongue speaker is to be quiet. Paul will actually say, be absolutely quiet 3 times in this text. The problem is it's well disguised in the NIV and many of our English translations. The Greek word that he uses for keep quiet is sagao. The tongue speakers in the NIV are called to keep quiet if there's no interpreter. Those that are speaking as prophets must stop so that someone else can speak. And women are told to remain silent and ask their husbands at home. But what Paul says all 3 times is sagao, to completely shh. He doesn't say sagao, period. He says to sagao in certain situations. The situation with the tongue speaker is, if there's no interpreter, then you need to be quiet. But he also tells the prophets that they need to be quiet. Verse 29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, just like 2 or 3 tongue speakers, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should sagao, should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets. So again, only 2 or 3 prophets were to speak, only one speaking at a time. That's the same for everyone. And while someone is speaking, the others are to listen and carefully consider what is said. Some people believe that means that there was this formal period of evaluation where all the prophets got together and discussed what another prophet said and decided whether it was kosher or not. I think probably that kind of setting would devolve in the kinds of argument and verbal fisticuffs that Paul is trying to avoid here. Now, I think he's rather saying, why don't the rest of you just listen and try to learn something while the other guy is speaking? But if someone who is listening gets a revelation from God, remember that's what prophets had, were direct revelations from God, then the one that is speaking must sagao. He must be quiet so the other guy can speak. The speaker must, in effect, in parliamentary procedure, yield the floor to his colleague so that the colleague can now speak. They aren't to sagao totally, they are just to be quiet so that someone else can speak. And third, he tells women to be quiet. We finally now get to our text. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. Like the prophets and the tongue speakers, women were to be silent. The setting here isn't as clear as it was for the prophets and tongue speakers because Paul has already spent a long time talking about those two things. Who were these women? Now remember, the word gune, woman, can also be translated wife. And Paul quickly shifts to talking about wives here. They are to ask their husbands at home. Peterson, in the Message translation, interprets the whole thing as pointing to wives. He interprets this or translates this: wives must not disrupt the worship, talking when they should be listening, asking questions that could more appropriately be asked of their husbands at home. Now, women or wives were not to sagao all the time. Remember, in 1 Corinthians 11, women were praying and prophesying. Nothing that Paul says in chapter 14 contradicts what he says in verse 11. They are to pray and prophesy while their heads are covered. Now, some would say, well, this is a small group. This is ladies' class. He's only talking. No, just as likely he's talking about a Zoom class or an internet streaming service. They didn't have those things in Paul's day. He's talking about church. Men prayed and prophesied with their heads uncovered. Women prayed and prophesied with their heads covered. The only difference was whether or not they wore the veil. The point is, Paul is not telling all women at Corinth to sagao all the time in church. That would mean they couldn't sing in church or make any sound in church. Sagao means to be completely quiet. In chapter 11, he is not interested in silencing women at all. They pray and prophesy. Now, the problem with the prophets and the tongue speakers, they were to sagao to avoid being disruptive. Women are told to ask their husbands at home rather than to go on talking. To ask their husbands at home as opposed to what? As opposed to interrupting church with constant, continual questions. For the first time, women are included with men in study and worship. They couldn't do that in Judaism. They didn't do that in pagan worship. They had some catching up to do. They were allowed a freedom they didn't have before. And there was a lot of things they didn't understand since they hadn't studied before. They needed to ask questions, but what they didn't need to do was to constantly disrupt the church. I was once teaching a small group that had several young adults there. One of my daughters was in the group. I'm not going to say which one. But Angela made this comment in class in response to something that came up. But at the time that she was talking, I got distracted by this horrendous typo in the lesson sheet that I had produced. Obviously, it was my secretary's fault for not catching that typo in advance, but it distracted me, and I really didn't pay that close attention to what Angela had said. So I didn't respond to her question or her comment. I just kind of left her hanging there. And she interpreting my non-response as non-acceptance, non-approval, and non-value to what she said. I have to wonder if that's how some women see the fact that they have no voice in church. Men do all of the speaking. We even quote the Bible to justify the fact that we do all the speaking. Why should women not see that as non-acceptance, non-approval, and non-value? What if someone came up to lead a prayer at the end of our service and I stopped them and I said, "I'm sorry, but you have red hair." Now, we love and value and respect all gingers everywhere, but we just don't allow people with red hair to speak in church. I'm sure you understand. Well, they wouldn't understand. They would interpret that as being disrespected. Of course, I would never say that to somebody with red hair because I have a soft spot for people with red hair. But I'm getting to the point where I'm not ready to stop my sisters from speaking in church either. I don't think either of the two texts that we've looked at so far in our study prohibit women from having a voice in church. They prayed and prophesied at Corinth. Their voice was heard. Now, they weren't allowed to hijack the service with their constant questions, but then neither were men who were prophets or actually women who were prophets, because women prayed and prophesied. People speaking in tongues weren't allowed to hijack the service either. Now, next week, we're going to look at the text that prohibits women from teaching or usurping authority over men. We're going to talk about what that passage says, what it means, and what it doesn't say, and what it doesn't mean. Reading Scripture, praying, giving testimony, those are not usurping authority. But if we thought it was, then we'd stop women from doing that in Sunday school classes. Sometimes the most servant-like thing that we can do for other people is just to listen to them. And maybe the problem in our churches is not that we think that women should not speak. Maybe the problem is that some of us just don't want to listen. Maybe the time has come for everyone to be allowed to speak and to everyone to be required to listen.